Good morning, everyone. Setting up here. Okay. Good morning, everyone. It's 8:06 in the morning on the East Coast. Do you know where your children are? It's last week we finished up on The Unseen Partner by Diane Croft. So this week, the discussion is going to be a continuation of A Mystical Path Less Traveled by Jerry Wright. I'm only about a third through that book. And to create a tandem, I'm going to go ahead and start to read Religious but Not Religious by Jason Smith. Now, we did a, okay, something like that. Religious but not religious. Yep. Here we go. Okay, so Religious but Not Religious by Jason Smith. Last Saturday, we did a Wisdom Path colloquium with Jason Smith, which was quite good. We didn't get through 1% of the ideas contained in his book, so I wanted to emphasize those. I'm not promising to go all the way through Jason Smith's book. We'll see. It's a 150-page book, and or more than that, about 192 pages. But we'll at least make a start of it so that you can have a sense of what it's like. And but I'm going to do it trading back and forth between his book and Mystical Path Less Traveled. So the next journal entry in A Mystical Path Less Traveled from Jerry is this one. We are born mystics with an innate connection to the visible and invisible aspects of the one reality. Religion is an optional add-on that can secure and support that connection or damage it. Many who give up on religious affiliation have been wounded in their primary connection to the sacred. Many others keep psychotherapists and spiritual directors busy trying to undo or heal the unnecessary damage. Following a mystical path is much more meaningful than following religious roads that require toll booths and road police. Following a mystical path is much more meaningful than following religious roads that require toll booths and road police. So, amen to that. What Jerry is driving at here is that many of us, at least in the United States, have had religion crammed down our throats one way or another. And the result of that fact is damaging. And, even I, who was brought up in the U.S. Navy, and therefore was exposed to very ecumenical chaplains during my time, am now turned off, because what seems to have happened is that fundamentalists have taken over the chaplain corps of the Navy, which is atrocious to me. And so the result is, when I go over to the U.S. Naval Academy Chapel, I go there when nobody else is there and do my own meditation there, because if I go to a service, what happens is these new Navy chaplains that we have tend to be giving a fire and brimstone fundamentalist message, and very often they're conflating religion with politics, which I don't approve of. I think when people are in an attitude of prayer, you shouldn't be haranguing them politically because they're vulnerable. So, as Jerry indicates, we can have plenty of mystical religious experiences just by paying attention in our everyday life. And if you're unfamiliar with my work in that area, go to this homepage of this YouTube channel and find my talk called Finding the Living God, in which I give a number of examples of numinous experiences, which I've had. Several of them have been in the Naval Academy Chapel when it was empty. And so I urge you to take a look at that if you're not familiar with those. Okay, I'm going to leave it at that for now. I'm going to go to the beginning. I'm going to go first to the introduction of religious but not religious. And so this is what Jason Smith starts with. Introduction. The decisive question. In 1939, Carl Jung gave a wide-ranging talk on the psychological importance of religion to the Guild of Pastoral Psychology. Founded just 2 years earlier with Jung as its patron, the Guild had been formed to encourage the study of psychology among clergy and other spiritual leaders, and to be a forum devoted to the exploration of the common ground between religion and psychology. In that talk, called The Symbolic Life, Jung made the following declaration, quote, "Now we have no symbolic life, and we are all badly in need of the symbolic life. Only the symbolic life can express the need of the soul, the daily need of the soul, mind you. And because people are no such thing, and because people have no such thing, they can never step out of this mill, this awful, grinding, banal life in which they are nothing but. Everything is banal, everything is nothing but, and that is the reason people are neurotic." Now, I have been critical of the organizers of the collected works of C.G. Jung for probably 15 years. And the reason for that is that in the collected works, there is one title that's called The Symbolic Life, but it is volume 18. And so when you're staring at a shelf full of books, normally you would think in terms of starting at book, volume 1, and here these important religious ideas that Dr. Jung came up with in his career are put back in volume 18. And I think this sort of expresses Dr. Jung's concern, number one, of creating the C.G. Jung Institute in Zurich originally, and number two, the reason that he made the statement, "Thank God I'm Jung, so I don't have to be a Jungian." And what he meant by that is that the C.G. Jung Institutes have focused primarily on clinical psychology and not on the general needs of the population and the collective unconscious, etc. So they tend to be, the Jungian societies tend to be intakes for Jungian analyst practices. So a Jungian analyst will write a little book, often it's a small book like this that I'll show you the spine. Okay, so it's fairly narrow in the spine, and I don't really think of it as a book per se based on my upbringing. I think of a book like this one, which is a book about Rainer Maria Rilke as more like a book. And I think of most of the books that I see written by Jungian analysts, I see them as kind of pamphlets or calling cards. And I've even heard a Jungian analyst say it's a calling card. And so the result is that a Jungian analyst will put together a little book like this, a pamphlet, and then, it'll be 150 pages long, but a lot of the times they're rehashing much of what's been said by others. And then in the break time of the presentation, people will come up to them and want to talk to them, and they use that opportunity to bring people into their practices. And, there's nothing wrong with marketing, and I don't object to that. But what I found in going to those Jung societies was that it was pretty basic material for the most part. I mean, some of them do offer courses, which are much better, but just the one-off presentation by a Jungian analyst is basically just a way to get people to come and meet the analyst and maybe work with them in the future. And so for that reason, I'm not very impressed, because I think that, I believe that the Jungian analyst group in general has basically hidden Dr. Jung's work on religion. And one of the reasons I didn't get into reading Dr. Jung's work from the beginning, right straight from Dr. Jung's pen, was because I thought it was going to be about clinical psychology, which is a profession that I have no interest in per se. I'm not an analyst. I'm not a mental health professional. I didn't want to be one ever. And so I thought his books were about that. And, honestly, when I first started to look at them, they seemed very complex to me. And so my eyes were glazing over. So I tended to read books about Jungian psychology rather than Dr. Jung's work itself. Now, that changed in about 2005 when I found the Carl Jung Depth Psychology Facebook page, which you might want to take a look at. That's organized by a friend of mine, Louis LaFontaine, and Louis has very diligently for the last 16 years been publishing longish quotes from Jung. And not just memes, but maybe a couple pages worth or something like that each day. And the result is, I haven't looked lately, but I think he has something like 82 or 83,000 followers on that Facebook page over the years. And so to his great credit, and he's done that quite diligently for, a couple of decades at least. And so there's a lot of material there. And because I was reading those things and they were making sense to me, I started to actually read Dr. Jung's work in its raw form. And what I very quickly realized is that Carl Jung was not talking in there about the practice of clinical psychology, at least not very much. Mainly, he was talking about religion and culture. And and of course, I learned about the collective unconscious. And so I started to be really worried that the things that Dr. Jung was talking about hadn't been promoted out in the general public. The Jungian analyst community doesn't tend to get involved in politics or political issues, because that, of course, will turn off some analysts. And they basically have hidden the real religious central core of Jungian psychology. And fortunately, that's changing with books like Jerry Wright's book about the mystical path less traveled, and also with Jason Smith's book. And so I urge you to look at those two books first. They're an innovation of the last decade or so that some Jungian analysts have been breaking with tradition and have started to talk about Jungian psychology in the context of religion, which is quite significant, I think, and really needed in the world. And, that's how and why I began doing my website, archetypeinaction.com, in 2010, because I wanted to express these things from my perspective. And since I'm not a Jungian analyst and I'm not a mental health professional, I have not felt constrained by the requirements of my profession. And I'm semi-technically semi-retired, and so I don't have to satisfy any licensing authorities or anything like that. Okay, so Cafe asks, what do you think about psychedelically induced mystical experience? And I would say that that is potentially unearned wisdom that's very dangerous. And so, many people who've been involved with recreational drugs, have had profound psychological experiences, numinous experiences, and have been changed by it. And, example of that is Stephen Fox, who is one of the Uber Boyo contingent. Stephen is a writer and video maker in Dublin, Ireland, and he does a remarkable job. And he did have some years ago a numinous experience involving drugs, which he readily admits that he did. The problem is, what is the consequence of doing that? When you come down from your trip, how do you reintegrate into normal life? And of course, getting involved in drugs is quite dangerous, because there's clearly the possibility of an addiction that finally can kill you, and quite rapidly. And we saw this, of course, with Dr. Jordan Peterson. Dr. Peterson has been a clinical psychologist for like 25 years. And he went on this incredible inflation high of going around the world doing his book tours. And to his credit, his books are quite good, especially Maps of Meaning. He said that he had reworked every sentence in that book 10 to 15 times, and it shows. It's a perfect book, but it's almost too perfect because it's a nut that's hard to get into. But if you can manage to get through it and get to the end, the last two paragraphs in it are awesome, I would say. And I would urge you to read that book. It will be, I would say it's distilled Jungian thought light. In other words, Dr. Peterson has boiled away all the life in the book and made it all logos. And he once said, I heard him say it on a lecture, that he's about saving the logos. And so he admits that he is trying to get the eros out of the picture. And of course, that's the problem with the scientific method since the Enlightenment, which is that every time we punch holes in a myth, we turn our backs on the sacred, and we desacralize the world. And we need to understand that we have a religious function in our psyche. And as a result of that fact, we really, really need to have something to help us along with that. And for me, that's been Carl Jung. Now, it can be a therapist, or it can be a priest or a theologian of some sort, who is more experienced and can take you along. What I found, I did it spontaneously. And so as a result of that fact, I came into the Jung orbit, and that happened basically in 1990. I had been exposed to Jung before 1990, and 87, I think, was the first time, really. But in 1990, I was in a bookstore in Washington, D.C., and I happened upon a hard copy of Man and His Symbols. And I said, that's interesting. And so I pulled it off the shelf and bought that book. I took it home. And then for the next year, I read it every night to my wife after we'd gone to bed. I would read 2 to 3 pages of that book before we went to sleep. And the result of that was that we both had Jungian dreams, among other things. But after the year in which we finished that book, we read it cover to cover, or I read it, she meditated on it. I certainly felt that I had a year of therapy. I felt good about myself, and it really helped me. Now, for my wife, she needs more structure. And so when in 1993, I think it was, I got a fax from my wife when I was traveling overseas. And she said, I found the one book in the world that if I were on a deserted island and could only have one book, this would be the book. And since my wife is a Phi Beta Kappa, I said, well, that must be some book. And the book was the Tibetan Book of Living and Dying. And so she started a path of Tibetan Buddhism. And so that's a religious path, of course. and it provides lots and lots of structure, and that was her way of getting into the material, the unconscious. And Dr. Jung, in fairness, said that he thought that Tibetan Buddhism actually came closest to his psychology. And there's a scene in one of the interviews with Dr. Jung where there's a tour of his home, and you can see two very large Tibetan tankas in one of his main rooms in his home. And so he had gotten into it quite a lot, and not to mention the Bhagavad Gita, which I've talked about before. So my wife, in the Myers-Briggs type indicator, she is a J. She's INTJ, which means that she likes structure, she likes shopping lists and things like that, whereas I'm a P, so I like an unstructured environment. And the way I describe that is a J and a P go to the grocery store. A J goes with a shopping list, goes up and down the aisles and pulls things off and checks them off the shopping list. A P goes to a grocery store, goes up and down the aisle with no shopping list, and at the end they check out and both eat. So it's not essential which way you do it, but what I find is that when she and I go shopping, I'm the one that buys the ice cream because she probably didn't put it on the list. And so anyway, she's a J, and so she likes structure. And so she has become an all but ordained teacher of Tibetan Buddhism, whereas I continued on the Jungian path and read the collected works, and in that process realized that the collected works are not about clinical psychology. They're really about religion and the collective unconscious and culture and the unconscious. So good morning, Estelle. And Big Cat, man and his symbols has some reference to LSD and its similarities to psychic disintegration. Okay, I don't remember that, but yeah, I would say that you're not keeping the guardrails going when you're in a drug-induced trip, and so I would just be very careful about psychedelics. That's unearned wisdom, and you can do what I do, which is as a spiritual practice, which is to underline books, as I've done with Jerry's book, or this is Jason's book, and because I do that, what it means is when I underline something, it means that I've stopped, thought that this was important, and in some way meditated on that passage or that phrase. And whereas if you read these books like novels and just whip right on through them, you're not going to get it. You won't grok it. And Phil says, good morning. I came across your red book and 7 sermons readings, and I've been tuning in. Pleasure to be here. Well, thank you, Phil. And also, by the way, I discovered last week that Audible now has a professionally produced Audible version of the red book. So my version, which is here on this YouTube channel, contains my commentary, and it is a complete reading. In one sense, I wanted to prove that I'd read the book cover to cover. And I was told at one point by a psychiatrist of some 40 years experience that he knew Jungians who had never read the Red Book. And and certainly I know some that had never read it, at least up until 2015. So the Red Book changed the Jungian psychology world quite dramatically. And, you know, if you go talk to a Jungian analyst and they haven't read the Red Book cover to cover, then talk to somebody else because they won't have updated information. And that's an important distinction. And so I read it cover to cover for this YouTube channel, mainly because I wanted to demonstrate that I had read it cover to cover and thought about it in detail. Let's see. Sandy, thank you, Mistel, for your comment. Sandy says, would you conclude your thoughts on Dr. Peterson's and drugs if you're happy to do so? And okay, yes, I will, Sandy. My point was that Dr. Peterson, even though he's a very astute man, he's written some extremely deep and well researched and thought about books like Maps of Meaning. He ended up getting himself addicted, and he was apparently he was prescribed a drug for depression, which he admitted on a number of talks that he had suffered from since his youth. And so he was prescribed a drug which was very hard to get off, and the process of getting off of it nearly killed him. And so here's a man who was flying high between 2016 and 2018, and as you know, he has more than 3 million followers on YouTube. And to a large extent, that's justified because I've enjoyed his work and I've learned from it quite a lot. And so, you know, I'm very appreciative of his work, and I agree with him 99.5% of the time. But the point is that even a man of that stature and that experience as a psychologist managed to get himself addicted. And so, you know, it's no wonder. The last time I looked at statistics was about 2017. And that year we had 70,000 Americans die of drug overdoses. Well, you know, we had 58,000 killed in the Vietnam War. So the carnage from drug overdoses is way higher than the Vietnam War. And it's nearly as high as COVID. So, you know, I can't tell anybody what to do, and I'm not going to do that, but I have never allowed myself to take drugs per se, unless it's prescribed. And even recently, when I had a small surgery about 6 weeks ago, and they prescribed oxycodone to me, my wife insisted that I needed to take this drug, and I wasn't going to because I've had a knee and an ankle replaced, and I found that I could take one of those and then thereafter just switch to Tylenol. It was perfectly okay, and I wasn't risking getting hooked. But this last time, 6 weeks ago, at her insistence, I took one oxycodone, and bring, I was awake for 24 hours, and it just woke me up entirely. I did not care for the experience, and I didn't remember having that experience from the earlier times. You know, they say that if you have pain and you need an opioid to deal with the pain, then it's okay to use the opioid. But if you don't continue to need it, you should stop it. And I absolutely agree with that. And I've never needed it more than, or at least in the last 2 decades, I've never taken more than one after surgery. And I've had some major surgeries and have another big one coming up in the fall, which is a hip replacement. And there's no way that I'm going to take these drugs, or at least not longer than I absolutely have to. And as a matter of fact, the oxycodone says, well, it has 375 milligrams of Tylenol in every pill. And so I say, okay, so why am I taking the opioid aspect of this? So anyway, you can manage your pain with Tylenol or ibuprofen, and those are over the counter. So I just take that position instead. And so anyway, going back to Jordan just for a minute. So here's a man of great stature who's very popular around the world, and he managed to get himself addicted, and he almost died, and he would have, but for the commitment of his daughter and son-in-law, who took care of him and took him to Moscow, took him to Serbia or Bosnia or Serbia, to specialized clinics where he was able to detox. And so, now he seems to be getting back into the rhythm of what he was doing before, but he's a changed man. And so I just point to that example as, when you're thinking, oh, geez, I think I'll just try a psychedelic to see if I can have a numinous experience. Well, just look at that example. I mean, he's a very good example of someone who got caught in addiction, and then it almost destroyed him and his life. It certainly destroyed his life for 18 months. And so we're all happy that he has recovered and is continuing to do his work, which is quite important. Now, on the topic of his what he says, I would say that I agree with him 99.5% of the time, and I sort of view him as sort of a surrogate father figure for many young people around the world who've been brought up in single parent households, and many of them are young men who've been brought up by their mothers, and so they haven't had the types of things that men would teach, especially young men. And so I think that Dr. Peterson has done a tremendous service in providing that. Where I get off is where he's suggesting that he's not a Jungian, or he is a Jungian. Right? He doesn't say that, and he's not a Jungian, and he doesn't say that, but what he does do is he quotes Jung a lot, and he has a lot of memes related to Jung that he points to in some of his lectures and so on. And so that's sort of cherry picking. That's like Dr. Jung saying, thank goodness I'm Jung and not a Jungian, because what the Jungian analyst community did over a century of time was that they basically created a profession of Jungian analysis. And so they cherry picked Dr. Jung's oeuvre, but it's evident to me after a lot of study of this and now knowing a lot of actually senior Jungians that, many of them do not really grok what Dr. Jung's work was about. They have learned a profession. So yeah, you can become a psychotherapist by just taking a master's degree in family therapy or something, and then go do the internship with a licensed psychologist for 2,000 hours, I think, in my state, and then you can be a psychotherapist. Well, that by no sense of the imagination does that make you a Jungian analyst, and so Jungian analysts don't even really talk about religion. I mean, for my lights, I think they are largely operating like a pastor would operate in a private consultation, for example, or in a confessional, but they don't admit it. And so the issue about volume 18 is that they hid a lot of the most important work that Dr. Jung did. A lot of his important essays are hidden in volume 18. And so if you're interested in religion and spirituality, etc., I urge you to take a look at volume 18, which is called The Symbolic Life. Big Cat says Peterson was addicted to benzodiazepines. They're the fastest trip to hell. Benzos are as bad as opioids. Yeah, okay. So I'm with Jordan Peterson. I'm where I get off though is he said about Ion, the book Ion, that he considered it the most dangerous book he had ever read, and he doesn't really get into Dr. Jung's later work. And if you think Ion is the most dangerous book you ever read, then you're definitely not a Jungian. And I do agree that Ion is challenging, especially for those of us who have been brought up as in the Abrahamic religions. And an example of that is the chapter 5 of Ion is called Jesus as a symbol of the self. And the first time I read that, I'm saying to myself, do you mean the Son of God? Is that what you're talking about? The Son of God is a symbol of the self? And I couldn't get my mind around it. It took me 10 years to do it. And finally, I had to actually lead a graduate school level seminar on Ion before I really grokked it. And I did that in our advanced reading group a couple of years back. And so if you were to join our advanced reading group, you would have access to all of our past sessions, including that one, and or including those. So there's 32 two-hour sessions on Ion in the Dropbox for the advanced reading group. I don't make those sessions public, only to people who are members of the advanced reading group, just so you know. That's why you can't find them on YouTube. But but I understand what Dr. Peterson's concern about it is, and that is that it sort of blows away the traditional myths of the Abrahamic religions, which is exactly what the books I'm reading now for you, Jason Smith's book, Religious But Not Religious, and Jerry Wright's book, Mystical Path Less Traveled. Both of them basically do that. And so Dr. Peterson, being a practicing university professor, has backed away from that. And, in fairness, even Jerry Peterson, even Jerry Wright, didn't talk about these things when he was serving as a practicing Presbyterian minister. He did that for 25 years. And then what he said is, I fell off the back porch of the church. And so then he became an analyst, and now he's going even further, and he is addressing these issues that I'm talking about. And so it's very clear from that position that Dr. Peterson took that he is not a Jungian. And if you're stuck in the logos, then there's no point in watching this YouTube channel, because Dr. Jung's work was entirely about the eros, which is where we live our lives. And just for shorthand, I'll repeat my often stated thing that you should look around your room, and everything in that room, with the exception of potted plants, is a result of the logos, including the computer, iPhone that you're watching this session on. And the thing about these things is that they're not alive. There's nothing alive about them. And we need logos, 100%. We need logos to be able to design a product, something like a book or any other physical object. We need design, and that has to be done very rationally. And that's all logos. That's all well and good. But the point is, we don't live in the logos. So you can't eat your computer, you can't eat a book and live. We live in the eros. And so in the eros side of the equation, yes, there is chaos, but there is also everything about your life that is life. And so the idea that we have to squelch the eros out of the system is not only wrong but dangerous. And we have seen the consequences of that in the 20th century, when we killed more than 280 million people, basically because people lost faith in the Abrahamic traditions. And the point is that all of those traditions are right, but people couldn't understand it. They couldn't see how it connects. Dr. Jung saw that and brought these connections back together. So the way I say it quite succinctly is, Friedrich Nietzsche said at the end of the 19th century, God is dead. By what he meant by that is that the religion, God as the religions taught God, is dead. And that God is dead, because there's no God up there. We can now look back to the Big Bang, and we can look down to the Higgs boson, and nowhere in the physical world do we see something we can call God. But Dr. Jung came along in the next generation and found the living God where he lives. or she lives, and how she goes about doing the work of the Godhead. And so that's what Jungian psychology is about. It's about how do you find the living God. This is why in 2005 or so, when I saw the video the first time where Dr. Jung is asked, do you believe in God? And he said, I have no need to believe. I know. And so once you've had that aha moment, nobody can take it away from you. And so belief is about being persuaded by somebody else, by something they want to teach you and want you to follow. And of course, all the religions, all the creeds want to do that because, among other things, you're bringing money into the coffers of those religions. So you're paying for the rice bowl of your pastor, rabbi, or Rinpoche, whatever it is. And, there's nothing wrong with that because we need someone to bring us along in our psychological development. And Dr. Jung pointed out that the great religions are all naturally evolved form of psychotherapy, and they communicate in symbols, the symbolic life, with mighty symbols, he says. And so, they have over the last 3,500 years or more provided a psychological route, let's say, to get you to where you need to go. But as my wife says, you can find her talk on the vanishing path on this YouTube channel. Just put the vanishing path on the webpage. She says, the creeds can only take you up to the edge of the cliff, but it's you that has to step off. And if you don't step off, you're never going to grok it. And if you don't know what grok means, Grok, please just do a search on it on Wikipedia, and that'll give you a better understanding. But once you grok it, then there's no need for anybody's creed. And so anyway, let's see. I'm going to go back now. So I think I've answered the Peterson question. I hope I have. Big Cat says some people need opioids. Yeah, that's a professional decision for medical healthcare professionals. I'm not one of those, and I'm not going to recommend any opioid here. And I don't, for most of us, I don't think it's necessary. I acknowledge that, probably I have taken a few opioids around my major surgeries, but I have a strong wish to get off of it as quickly as possible and just rely on Tylenol. And so I'm not going to address anything further on the drug issue. You really have to work that out for yourself. So Big Cat says, I think if you really pay attention to your own dreams and study them, you can actually induce a psychedelic state. I think that is what occurred to Jung in his Red Book period. I think you're right about that. And I've had a similar experience. in 1993 where I had a possession of my anima for a period of about 8 months. And it caused me to write a novel, which was my outlet to control that. So I had an experience very much like Dr. Jung. I didn't know that at the time because the Red Book wasn't published until 2009. But when I first got my Red Book, I said, oh my God, here's the greatest psychiatrist, psychologist of the 20th century, and he's had an experience like my experience. So I must be okay. I must be not crazy. So the reason I didn't go back to trying to write novels was I was afraid of it for that 16-year period. But I know now that, you know, when writers have writer's block, for example, it's because they can't get back to that state. And that's a state from which a very natural and very effective novel comes through. And so a lot of famous novelists have used alcohol or drugs to try to reinduce that state, and they end up killing themselves, basically. And Ernest Hemingway is one of those, and there are many other sad examples, and it's a problem of many creative people, not only in literature, but also painters or others. And so I think it's best if you try to avoid that, but to understand what the numinous state is and understand how to recognize it. And so when Dr. Jung said, I have no need to believe, I know, what he meant was, and I had an epiphany at that moment and said, I too know, but what is it that I know? And I had to study for 10 years before I really grokked it. But it comes down to this. If you have to believe, then you're believing somebody else's doctrine. You're not necessarily believing, or you're not necessarily doing what your psyche tells you. And so if you say you believe, then you're following somebody else's doctrine. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's what all religions have done for thousands of years, and it has served humanity very well, where the religion takes you along step by step from youth to old age and helps you with the transformations of life. Fine, that's great. And if you have what Dr. Jung called the charisma of belief, stick with it, because you haven't done anything wrong by being in a religion. And if it has taken you up to the edge of the cliff and you've stepped off, and you know because of that, nothing like it. You know, that's just like downtown. But you don't know until you've taken that step. And so I say that I have faith. Dr. Jung called it pistis, which is that I have faith that everything will be all right. And if you listen to our conversation with Linda McFadden yesterday about in the steps of Bridget, or in Bridget's footsteps, about the emergence of the eternal feminine, you find that it's largely about midwifery and spiritual midwifery. In other words, all theologians are trying to midwife this process of psychological transformation for you to the point where you can take the step. And then you have faith. You don't need to believe, and, I'm certainly there, but, most people need to go step by step. And, certainly it supported me in some ways for many years, until I started to read Jung. And then I realized, oh, by the way, I've been missing something all along. And so anyway, Sean Smith said, what was Jung smoking in that pipe of his? Good question. I don't know. I'm not going to address that. Yeah, the Big Cat says many artists create when in a trance, a shaman. They become shamans, and I would concur with that. And Miss O says, I follow the trail of the luminous experiences, and me too. And we can also call them synchronous experiences, because they're things that happen that are unexplainable. And synchronous experiences happen to me every day, multiple times a day. And so it's not like it's some great revelation that is going to happen. It's just that things happen that you can't explain. And those happen to me daily. And they happen to you daily. You just need to become sensitive to them. The cat says, I wish I could believe. Yeah, well, that's what Dr. Jung said. He said, some people have the charisma of belief, and they're good. That's all right. And remember, one of the first books that Dr. Jung wrote, which is now in the collected works as volume 5, called Symbols of Transformation, or Symbols of Transformation. He was already saying this, because this is what the religions are about. And it takes a while for this to sink in, what he was saying, because remember, he had 7 uncles who were theologians, and his father was a theologian. And so he didn't want to start a war with theologians as he was developing these ideas of his. And as he was early in with Dr. Freud, he just didn't want to rock the boat. And so he never challenged religion, but that's what he was doing, obviously. But he never I would say he never manifested a direct challenge to religion. There are very few debates with him, between him and theologians. In some cases, there are conversations. For example, he had a multi-year long correspondence with Dr. Our father, Victor White. And Victor White was a Dominican priest, and he was head of Dominica House at Cambridge. So the part of Cambridge that was producing Dominican priests. And Dr. White, Father White had for many years been in basically Jungian analysis before 1940. And he hadn't communicated with Jung, but he had been in treatment with a Jungian analyst in London. And so after the war, he searched Dr. Jung out and started to communicate with him. And that's a very powerful correspondence. I urge you to take a look at that. But, Dr. Jung said, okay, this is in 1945 or 46. So in 1945, Dr. Jung was 70 years old. He'd already written a very large part of the collected works by that time. And he said to Father White, you're my black raven because you're the first theologian that has really concurred with me about a lot of these topics. And Dr. White, Father White, had been very much helped by Jungian analysis, and so they were close for a number of years, and then they had a falling out because Father White couldn't quite get there. And so what Jung said is Father White came within sight of the holy city, but he couldn't come through the gate. And so that's what happens. Let's see. So Justin says, I don't believe, I think I infer, but I try to put my audience into a trance-like state. And of course, that's what a rock concert does too. And so if you can carry people to another place in their psyche, often you're going to be a very successful artist. And he says, like Salvador Dali, I am the drug. Yes, okay, I am the drug too. And Ms. Still says some operating systems are faster, definitely. And this is going to start happening faster and faster thanks to the internet. And yesterday we had a discussion about this exchange with Max Weber, Max Zeller, where Max Zeller had a dream about building a temple. And Dr. Jung said to him, well, that's the temple we all build on. And believe me, there are thousands of people doing it all over the world, in China and Russia and so on. And he says, that's the temple for the new religion. And Zeller asked Zeller asked Jung, boy, there's a Freudian slip, holy cow. Zeller asked Jung, how long will this new religion take to emerge? And Jung said 600 years. So I stumped the stars yesterday because I asked Linda McFadden whether she thought, now that we have the commercial internet, whether this development would be faster than 600 years. And she said, wow, I haven't thought about that. That's a good question. And what I think is that it's happening faster and faster. And as more and more people are exposed to these issues and work through them personally, then we're going to have psychological transformation much faster than Dr. Jung could have predicted, because of course he didn't know about even PCs, let alone the commercial internet. So, and what the consequence of connecting everybody up would be. And obviously that's been an earth-shaking change. Let's see. So Sandy says, having had and continuing to have my own limited versions of the Red Book numinous experience, I know what I know no, and this conversation is reassuring. Yeah, absolutely. In fact, that's what Dr. Jung recommended, is that you create your own red book. You shouldn't be replicating his. And certainly for those of you who know something about my novel, you know that Dr. Jung would never have written that novel. But nonetheless, the experience is analogous. And so I can testify from personal experience on that. Justin says, why you use drugs when you can get high on yourself? And besides, isn't the universe psychedelic enough in the first place? Amen to that. And, you know, you know, for me, I'm communicating from the self when I do this on Sunday morning or any of our conferences that I do, because, and I know that because after it's done, I have no clue what we've talked about or what I've said in a particular session. And so that means I'm like Ernest Hemingway was asked once, how do you write a novel? And he said, I open a vein and bleed. And that's sort of metaphorical for what I do on these Sunday morning sessions, which is that I start talking and one thing leads to another. And before long, you're hearing things from my deep unconscious. For example, that whole dissertation I did on Jordan Peterson earlier. I don't even now, I don't remember what I said in that part of the conversation, but the point is that it's opening up unconscious places in my psyche, and then I bleed it out to you. And so I become in a sort of trance state, I would say. And so what you want is, in any art, for example, is you want something that is going to take you away from your everyday troubles. You want something that's numinous, and if it's very mundane and you have to grunt it out, then you know it's not going to be very good also. and so, you know, any art is also like that. I mean, if you're going to be a great artist, you know, you obviously have to learn the rules of the road and the basics of color and that sort of thing, and design and shape and etc. But at such point as you don't really have to think about those things, then it flows. And so you want the flow. That's the flow. Let's see. Okay, I wanted to mention, by the way, that Jordan Hoggard, who has been my partner in these sessions for the last 6 or 8 months, has moved from Philadelphia to Taos, New Mexico over the last 2 or 3 weeks. And so it has been hard for him to participate. And so I miss having the repartee with him. And I would love to have any of you feel free to join the Zoom conference and help move me along in my discussion. When I do it solo like this, it's harder, and so it's helpful if I have. And so now I'm relying on the YouTube chat, which is fine. That's a good way to do it too, and is to keep bouncing things back and forth. So I present these things. And Miles says, check out Bon Jovi rocking it in Zurich, Switzerland in 2000. Too bad you couldn't have attended. Yeah, absolutely. Sandy, I was brought up in the Anglican church, and yes, it's profound, the impact of that life experience. Yes. So Justin says, but I do have a faith, Baha'i. I answered to the big cat. Many artists create when in a trance-like state. Yeah, that's what I'm talking about. The flow. It is a trance-like state, but what it is doing is it's opening the flow between your unconscious and your conscious, so that it's more natural and it's not contrived. I don't plan these conversations for Sunday morning. I just turn on the Zoom session and let it flow. And that's if you're an artist or you're going to build anything, you want to be able to let things flow, because if you do, you're going to be better at it. Sandy, you're in Australia. Nice to see someone from down under. And Helen Barfield said, poets will save the world. That is why I am a Bon Jovi fan, among others. Yes, okay. So there's lots of great poetry out there. As we know, Bob Dylan has won the Nobel Prize for Literature. And I'm sure that surprised lots of people around the world, including me. I've been a Bob Dylan fan for, more than 50 years, but I never expected that the Nobel Committee, which is, I think of as quite traditional and conservative, would select Bob Dylan. But now that after they have, I certainly can't deny that he's worthy of the award. And I was very amused when, in the year that he was granted the award, and he declined to come to Stockholm for the ceremony, which I think was a good thing. And I remember seeing a group of the scientists who had also been awarded that year sitting around a table, and one of them said, well, thank God that Bob Dylan didn't come, because if he had come, he would have sucked all the air out of the room. And that's very, very true. I mean, that's the power of what we're talking about. You can tap along on the scientific method for years and years and years and have a lot of disappointment. But if you're an artist, you've arrived, and you want to get to the point where you have that flow. Okay. Sean says, I went to a neural ethics conference in Vancouver and got deported. That must have been some conference. Anyway, okay. So I'm going to go on and go back to Jerry here. And so I'm going to read from A Mystical Pathless Travel by Jerry Wright. And this is a journal entry. Heaven and hell, homes to supernatural deities and devils, have been convenient hiding places for human capacities and human responsibility for both creativity and destruction. They have been closets for unconscious contents too heavy or too frightening to carry. Our collective closets are full, spilling out in all manner of individual and collective symptoms, a massive intentional and persistent spring cleaning may be required before our species can flower again. Well, I think that that's fairly obvious, because if organized religion is enough, I mean, one of the issues is that theologians put themselves between God and the average person. And so the result is that most religions sort of write numinous experiences or run them out of the system, and yet they're all pointing back to specific numinous experiences. And so I had the interesting experience of reading Seven Pillars of Wisdom, and I've read some of it on the YouTube channel here. And T.E. Lawrence was talking about the fact that in the desert and in the Middle East, there are revelations all the time. People out in the desert have revelations, but none of them really took, except Christianity and Judaism, of course. And the reason that the Judaism took was because it was in touch with civilization. And so, for example, the stories of the Old Testament were in touch with the civilization of ancient Egypt. And whereas, Bedou tribes out in the desert, they would have their revelations, but nothing would happen to them because they were all fighting over wells, and still are. And so what happened was that these religions came in contact with the Hellenistic developments in Greece, and that combination allowed these creeds to be founded. And what the creeds do is they basically intercess, they get between you and God, if you will, or you and the numinous experience, and ground it, basically. And so this is what the priest is doing in the Mass, for example, or we're doing in communion in the Protestant church. And it puts bread on the table for the theologians, but most people don't really have a numinous experience. But it's why fundamentalists, for example, have all these shocking things in their services, like they'll do the wave where people are doing this, and of course that gets people into a trance, and then they'll pull out a snake and play with it, and all those things sort of shock you, I guess, and those can be numinous. But I've attended a couple of fundamentalist sessions like that, and I realized right away that what they were doing was trying to hypnotize you and manipulate your psyche. And so I pulled away from it pretty fast. Let's see. So anyway, the further point then about T.E. Lawrence was, he said that, these revelations come up all the time if you're living in the desert, but it has to congeal with something. And that was the unique aspect of Christianity, especially. Let's see. Okay, So, all right, now going back, I'm going to go back to Jason Smith. So we've gotten through one paragraph and one quote here so far in the introduction. So let me read the next paragraph and see what comes. This often quoted passage is a powerful statement about the dangers associated with a human life that has become emptied of the kinds of experiences that enable a person to access a dimension of living beyond the daily grind. Whatever Jung meant to indicate with the idea of the symbolic life, it is clear from this quote that it refers to something that stands in contrast to the mundane and concrete struggles of everyday life. But more than this, it is to be understood as something crucial to emotional and psychological health and well-being. When people are unable to escape from the banal, the ordinary, or the merely rational, Jung is suggesting they become more susceptible to suffering and neurosis. And boy, I'm sure all of us have had that experience over the last year with COVID. We need something to allow our mental health to recalibrate, let's say. And so, it's very common for women to get together for coffee clutches, and men get together in all the cafes of the Middle East and sit all afternoon drinking coffee and solving the problems of the world. And indeed, we're doing that right here. And we need this kind of interaction in order to be right about ourselves. And if we don't have it, it just backs up, and it starts to cause neuroses. And so we really need a collective attachment with the world in some way. This is mine. I mean, since COVID, I have a 90-year-old mother-in-law that lives right next to us. And so since COVID began, we've been basically quarantined until we got our first vaccinations in February. And if it had just been the three of us, my wife, my mother-in-law, and me in quarantine together, it would have been a very long experience. But fortunately, I already had this YouTube channel going, and so that allowed me to maintain my mental health. And so I'm always looking, as I present things on this channel one way or another, I'm looking for what my self tells me to do, what I should be doing. And I pay attention to that. And so I've now been doing this Sunday morning session for, I guess, 9 months. And it's quite satisfying to me because, for one thing, I know I'm getting around certain authorities in another part of the world who will allow people to hear Zoom conferences, but they won't allow them to read YouTube. And so I have intentionally set this hour so that I could reach that part of the world, which I have done quite a lot. And it's very appreciated. And, in places like Australia, for example. And so that this interaction with you, for example, on this YouTube chat is very important for my psychic health. And I'm hoping and I'm gathering that it might be important to each of you as well, because we have many who are repeat participants here. And I'm grateful for that. Just in case, says, once I bicycled across the Pyrenees, won't ever do that again. I'm sure that must have been quite challenging. Okay, I'm going to just let your conversation ride there. Phil says, I'm very appreciative of your Sunday morning session. I agree that this type of collective gathering is necessary to a certain degree to avoid the onset of neurosis. And so, normally we have the opportunity of conversation with our friends, and, it stimulates us to, be connected to the world. And I'm an introvert, so if I don't have that stimulation, I will withdraw more and more into myself, which is not healthy. And I know that. And so, so this time frame starting at 8 a.m. in the East in the U.S. is not copacetic for most Americans. And so I'm intentionally reaching a different part of the world. Okay, so going back to Jerry Wright's book, Mystical Path Less Traveled, his next journal entry is, we need not be surprised, though often we are, that life is full of surprises. Even though instinctually we desire safety and predictability, most of our carefully laid plans and intentions seldom unfold as we expect or hope. Ironically, surprises may be the most predictable aspect of our human journey. Surprises challenge our illusion of control, the illusion that we are in complete charge of this one wild life that courses through us, and that meets us from without. The Greeks spoke of surprises as the action of Hermes, while Native Americans attributed them to trickster, whose purpose was to shake things up and to disturb the status quo. Serendipity is a cousin of surprise, and Jung's writings on synchronicity are a more developed member of the family. Given the capriciousness of fate, walking the mystical path requires holding the reins of life loosely and going with the flow, or we could employ the religious word trust if we could rescue it from the common reference to assent to a set of doctrinal formulas. Wisdom suggests that we must learn to trust the mysteries rather than to manage the mysteries. The former allows us to live open-handedly. The latter requires clenched fists and teeth. And boy, would I ever say that in my life. I mean, when I was in high school, let's say, I would never have imagined that I would someday be a lieutenant colonel in the Marine Corps, for example. And yet I did do that. And while I was a Marine, I became a lawyer and went to law school and practiced law. And, I thought, once I got my law degree and started practicing, then the financial aspect of my life would be taken care of, and I would just be able to coast after that. Well, no, that didn't work at all. I enjoyed going to law school very much, because it's very much like the work I do now. In studying Jung. So I always liked studying, but when I got into the practice of law and did it for 5 years, I found that I absolutely detested the practice of law. I do detest it to this day. And it's also why I would never be a psychotherapist, because I don't really care to work with other people's hardships. I'm better as a teacher, I suppose, and I've enjoyed my time as in teaching, but not as a lawyer. And then I went to business school thinking again that, if I got that would be the end. And that wasn't. And then 2008 came along and wiped out my net worth. And I say, oh my God, and every time I do something, I go off the rails and things are destroyed. And it's only thanks to understanding something about Dr. Jung's work that has kept me sane at all. And so, for the last 30 years, I've been carrying a Jungian book with me in my travels, and I've done a lot of it. And we just have to be open to the possibilities. So in a bit of that is a problem for me, in the sense that I am so open that I'm perhaps too open sometimes, or I see too many opportunities. So I'll give you an example. Next year, we're going to do this confluence. We're calling it confluence now, called The Creator's Art, a confluence of psychology, religion, and spirituality, I guess. And so what happens to me is that once I have in mind doing something like that, then more and more ideas just pour into my brain, and it gets crazy. So I'll give you an example. This is pretty funny from this morning. This came up. I'll have to read you an email from one of my partners, because I've recruited 4 other people to do this confluence with me. And so as many of you know, on the 7th of May, I spent the day in Helena, Montana, with my partner, Tim Holmes. And Tim has a remarkable studio of 7,000 square feet. And in it, he has about 5,000 drawings and paintings leaning up against the wall and all over the place. And in the basement, he has 280 sculptures in his inventory. It's just a remarkable place. And it's haunted. It was originally built as a home for wayward women. It's right across the street from a fundamentalist Catholic church. And it was a place where so-called wayward women could go and be taken care of by nuns. Well, Tim says we don't know what happened to the wayward men, but in any case, after 25 years, it changed its function and became a furniture warehouse for about 85 years. And then in about 1990, Tim took it over as his studio. And it's just an amazing place. And I urge you to take a look at timholmesstudio.com. And he has a little tour of his studio on there, which you should definitely take. It's a 5-minute video. So after I was with Tim for this 33-hour period, which involved all of the 7th of May of this year, I went home and it suddenly came to me that we should do some sort of conference. And that has evolved now to a confluence of thinking and ideas and art and so on. And so, I was half joking. I said, Tim, don't vacuum, don't change a thing. All we have to do is bring people to your studio and they will have a numinous experience, which is assuredly true. But anyway, one of the organizers, so I had said, half joking, tongue in cheek, that really all we have to do is offer people the chance to stay overnight in Tim's studio, which I did for 2 nights, and I had any number of numinous things going on, just zinging around in my psyche during that time. And so I said, all we have to do is just rent cots and have everybody sleep in the same room, and they'll all have a numinous experience. And we've been talking about inviting theologians. And so the retired psychiatrist in our group writes me this note this morning. And he's a couple with Sherry Lovler, who's another one of the organizers. And he said, we had a funny moment today, though. Where all these ideas came from, who knows, but it must be all the talk about title, religion, the 4 disciplines not in the title, the numinous experience, drawing portraits, and who knows what else. But Sherry simply said something today about Skip, and I think wanting Tim to draw nude portraits, which isn't part of the plan. If you come to our confluence, you will not be asked to pose nude, and we won't be doing nude portraits of anybody that's coming to the conference. But anyway, John says, I looked at her a little confused. Of theologians? And I asked in all innocence. We've been laughing about it ever since, and tonight I thought of that poor young theology student coming to our confluence and being put on a cot in Tim's studio overnight with 40 other people, and then getting up in the AM and having this nude portrait drawn by Tim. Numinous experience. That would certainly put our confluence on the map. So I read that to you so that the reputation of our confluence will be grow legs out in our general community here. And by the time we actually do it next June, a year from now, because it literally is the 10th to the 14th of June next year. By the time we do it, it's going to be so legendary that we may have to expand beyond Tim's studio for the venue, which will be fun. That'll be a nice problem to have. So anyway. So Miles said, I was disturbed and impressed by the number of low-flying fighter jets roaring around in Europe in 1983. One roared about 20 meters over me in Germany, almost rode into the ditch, I'm sure. And that would be a numinous experience. I'll give you a little more extreme one, which is a naval aviator I know. I talked about during the first Gulf War, he was doing a low pass over Saudi Arabia, and he was, I'm not sure he was at Mach 1, but he was going fast. And he came up behind a shepherd out in the middle of the desert. And he simply went over the shepherd and his flock and then just went vertical and went directly up in the sky. And so talking about a numinous experience, that would be a numinous experience if you were a Saudi shepherd out in the middle of the desert and suddenly an F-18 went over your head like that. So yeah. And Justin is talking about the fact that the idea in Europe is to use the highways as runways, and very definitely. In fact, we do spend way too much money on that, but it also has changed our world because, I don't know if any of you know this, but in 1935, Dwight Eisenhower, then a lieutenant colonel in the Army, and George Patton, also a lieutenant colonel in the Army, were tasked, because promotions were slow between the wars, they were tasked to drive a convoy of Army trucks and tanks and things across the United States from Philadelphia to San Francisco, I think. And it took them 55 days to do it. And so after 20 years later, when Eisenhower was president of the United States, he was convinced that we had to create an interstate highway system, which would double for rapid movement tank warfare and also as landing places for military aircraft. And so I presume this is true in Europe, but it's certainly true in the United States, that all interstate highways are meet the specifications for supporting tanks. And during my Marine Corps career, 5 years I spent in the 8th Tank Battalion, and we had actual tanks in our reserve centers. And in the summertime, we would go on a 2-week exercise, and we would literally drive the tanks up the interstate highway. So I actually have experience with that, and it works quite well. And of course, it would surprise the tourists who were going to the Thousand Islands for a vacation, and all of a sudden they'd come upon a platoon of Marine Corps tanks driving along the highway, but that's the way it was. Okay, let's see. Okay, I'm actually not going to get into the next Jerry Wright thing because that is going to be a longer discussion, and I don't want to address it this morning because I don't have time, and it's going to engender a lot of discussion with you. So let me just read to the end of this first segment of Jason Smith's introduction in Religious but Not Religious, Living a Symbolic Life. So here's what Smith says. The phrase "the symbolic life" encapsulates an important core of Jung's psychology. Indeed, the editors of his collected works chose it for the title of one of the volumes of that 21-book set. It is a phrase that continues to have resonance in the Jungian world and has been put into use by several theorists and authors since Jung's time. It is not, however, a phrase that appears in Jung's writings with frequency. A quick glance at the general index of Jung's collected works reveals that there is no other reference to it apart from its use in the 1939 talk quoted above. Given Jung's insistence that it is only the symbolic life that can satisfy the daily need of the soul, we are left wanting a deeper understanding of what he clearly believes to be a crucial expression of human life. What are the components of the symbolic life, and why is it that we are badly in need of it? And if we are, in fact, cut off from this essential aspect of life, how can we find our way back to it? It is these questions with which this book is concerned. So Jason Smith's book addresses that. And as you see, I've marked his book up quite heavily. And so there's a lot to talk about. We spoke with, as I said, we spoke to Jason a week ago in the Wisdom Path Colloquium. And at the end of it, I felt we had covered maybe 1% of the very numinous and important ideas contained in his book. And so I urge you to go listen to that discussion, which was only a week ago. So it's still on the homepage of this YouTube channel. And I will be continuing to read segments of this book. I'm not sure I'm going to read it end to end verbatim, but as I'm doing with Jerry's book, but I think these are both good conversation starters, let's say. And we've only gotten through like a page of Jerry's book and a page and a half of Jason's book in this session, so you get the idea. So Justin said he's seeing a lot of airplanes in Western Europe. And so what many of you may not know is that there's a reason why American forces are still in Europe after all these years, particularly in Germany. And it doesn't have anything to do with World War II anymore, per se. But the essence of the reason is that they represent the tripwire that saves Western Europe in the event of invasion from Russia. And the reason it works that way is because if Russia chose to be aggressive, as it's still attempting to be in Ukraine now, then Americans would be blooded also. In other words, if there's a place in Germany, I believe, called the Fulda Gap, and that's a gap in the mountains in the Alps of Germany, I believe. And I'm not an expert on this by any means, but I know that exists. And back when I was serving and looking at defending Western Europe, the concern was that at the time the Soviet Union had thousands and thousands of tanks, and that if they chose to take over Western Europe, they would simply flood through the Fulda Gap 5,000 tanks in one go. And if they did that, they could roll Western Europe fairly easily and could probably get at least to the pyramids, and maybe, I'm sorry, at least to the Pyrenees and into Spain, going fast in about 2 days. And so they could roll Western Europe in a couple of days, which is basically what Adolf Hitler did in 1939. And but they could do it even faster today. Or they could do it even faster 40 years ago when I was in it. I don't know if Putin's Russia, which has an economy the size of Italy, could do that anymore, but certainly the USSR could have. And so the purpose of that is, in terms of NATO and why America is still in Europe with large numbers of troops, is so that honestly, so that some Americans would be killed in that event, and that would cause the American nation to become up in arms, and then we would get into the war to take Western Europe back. And that's basically what did happen in World War II. Of course, the war began September 1st, 1939, and the U.S. didn't get into it until 27 months later. And the thing that got us into it was the attack on Pearl Harbor. And so, but if you ever wonder, if you're in Western Europe and you see a lot of American military aircraft, that's or other equipment, then you'll know that that's why it's there. It's not because we as Americans can stop an invasion with those troops. There wouldn't be enough to accomplish that. But the deep purpose is so that lots of Americans would be killed in the battle, and that would stir up America enough to come and take Europe back if the Soviet Union had taken it. And so, that's very much the same today. And so you should be, if you're in Europe and you see American troops there, you should be thankful that they're there, because their biggest purpose of being there is to die for you, literally, so that you would be able to fight back in a big conflagration. Now, I don't think that will ever happen, and I don't think Russia, as it's currently constituted, has the power to do that anymore. But nonetheless, it's a difficult world, and we have to all be cognizant of that. So. Right, and Justin says that all these countries do train in the Baltic Sea area, including Russia, and I agree with that. Justin says they rarely fly over downtown. Well, if you've ever been right in front of a F-18 that's taking off, you'll know why you don't hear them in downtown, because it is an earth-shattering experience to be close to them, to be that close to them. And And Miles says, the U.S. Bill of Rights, First Amendment, 1791, is something unique. I'd like to do a survey of nations for anything similar. And Miles, I want to refer you to the United Nations International Declaration of Human Rights, which does adopt the First Amendment. Well, it doesn't adopt the First Amendment, but it certainly adopts all the pieces of that amendment in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Yep, and just as talking about a nuclear accident, and we human beings are all threatened by our nuclear weapons that we have anywhere in the world, and it's a very serious issue. Some nuclear scientists say that if only 23 nuclear weapons were detonated at or about the same time, that it would destroy all life on Earth. Other scientists say it's as many as 100, but it's not many. We have vastly more than that number in the arsenals of the world, and so this is it's a very serious issue. It's an issue that isn't taken lightly, and I know that it's not something that our former president was trained in, so he wouldn't have known. But I remember before the election of 2016, he was saying, well, why don't we use nuclear weapons? And that's why. And the people that are involved in nuclear weapons in the United States are very thoroughly trained over many years. And I'm sure that that's one place where the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the United States, held our former president back so that he wouldn't use such a thing. And we have to pray that those people who manage these weapons continue to be well-trained, well-experienced, and in control of what they're doing, because any little match in the tinderbox can destroy us all. So Justin's well aware of how the jets sound. Yes, anyway. Okay, so it's 10 o'clock here in the East, and I'm going to terminate this session for today. Thank you all for being here, and I hope my soliloquy hasn't been too boring. And I have been gratified to see how many people have been consistently on the YouTube channel today, and I appreciate your interest. And so mark your calendars for a year from now when we're going to do our confluence in Helena, Montana. And so if you're from outside the United States, work on your visas early. And we look forward to seeing you in Helena, Montana 1 year from now. And by the way, if you ever wanted to see Yellowstone National Park, we are going to run at least a 2-day tour after the confluence. And Tim tells me that you need at least 2 days to see anything big in Yellowstone. So we're going to, Helena is quite close to Yellowstone National Park, and so we will take advantage of that. I know I think I probably was at Yellowstone when I was a little boy. I don't remember that specifically. I know I drove past or through Montana on my way to Alaska when I was 5 years old. But I don't remember if my mother made a side trip or not. Certainly we used to do that sort of thing. And so anyway, I'm looking forward to it. I don't have any youthful memories of being there, so I want to see what it's like, and I hope you'll all join us. So peace, and enjoy the rest of your day.